Well, welcome everyone to Daily Dose of Aramaic, this special bonus episode. And we are celebrating something big today. We've just finished reading through the Aramaic of the book of Daniel. And so, here, sort of at this center point of going through the biblical Aramaic material, we're going to start with the biblical Aramaic of Ezra soon. I thought, what better way to celebrate than to be able to have a talk with Dr. John Cook. So Dr. John Cook is professor of Old Testament and Semitic languages, as well as director of Hebrew instruction at Asbury Theological Seminary. Over the past 25 years, he's also taught at a number of other institutions, both in North America and overseas. Dr. Cook is a sought-after reader-examiner for doctoral dissertations in the field of ancient Hebrew language and linguistics, which are among his specialization areas within the broader discipline of Old Testament studies. Dr. Cook has authored many frequently cited journal articles and books, among them several of the books on my shelf. So the first here, Time and the Biblical Hebrew Verb, and then Beginning Biblical Hebrew, that teaching grammar, as well as a more recent Intermediate Biblical Hebrew, and a special interest to our viewers today, Aramaic, Ezra, and Daniel, a handbook on the Aramaic text, which is on the Baylor Handbook to the Hebrew Bible series. We're all looking forward to several books on the way, including Linguistics for Hebraists, The Biblical Hebrew Verbal System, a Linguistic Sketch, and a Valency Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, probably among others. There are probably more books coming. So if you attend professional meetings, there's a good chance that you will see Dr. Cook there presenting the fruits of his research and teaching. Also, in addition to his duties at Asbury Theological Seminary, he teaches and preaches in local churches. So it's my joy to celebrate Dr. Cook. So welcome, Dr. Cook, to Daily Dose of Aramaic.
Thanks a lot, Scott. It's great to be here. It really is.
Well, this is wonderful. So would you please share what led you to become an academic in the field of biblical studies?
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, I and this is going to sound perfect for your blog on your podcast on Aramaic. I fell into it mainly because of my love of languages. I actually went off to undergraduate at Moody Bible Institute because I wanted to become a youth pastor. And, like so many of us, I had an influential youth pastor, and that led me to want to go help others. And when I got there, talking to classmates of mine, they introduced me to Greek, and I had 1 year of Latin in high school. But being a high school student, you're not overly motivated, and so after 1 year in ninth grade, I left that alone and didn't pursue it any longer. But Greek intrigued me, and after 1 year of Greek, where it was enjoyable working through the Greek text and learning some of that, someone challenged me, why don't you go ahead and take Hebrew at the same time as Greek? And at that point, I was hooked after just getting into Hebrew and just fell in love with the language, and decided at that point, I realized I could actually, instead of taking these exegesis classes where someone would tell me what the text was saying in English from the Hebrew to the English, I could actually substitute my language courses for it. And so I ended up taking 2 years of Greek and 2 years of Hebrew in my undergraduate, and replacing all my Bible classes with that on the assumption that I could learn what's in the Bible myself directly by looking at it in the original languages, rather than somebody else filtering it for me through a translation or a commentary or something like that. So I fell in love with it at that point, and I really still was not ready to go wholesale into academics. I was actually looking at doing a master's at that point, simply because of my love of the languages and my love of Bible. And I was trying to decide, Old Testament or New Testament, what do I want to focus in? And somebody finally mentioned me. He goes, well, why don't you do an MA in one and go do a PhD in the other? And that was the first time I ever even considered a PhD. And and it was a long road through there. We actually spent 2 years at Trinity, and then we went overseas for a hiatus before I even went on to my PhD. But that's really what lured me in, is a love of the languages.
That's fantastic. And that's driven you your whole academic career, right?
Yeah, really has. It really has been the overriding thrust of everything that I'm doing is getting people into the original languages and facilitating them being able to get direct access to what's in the Bible.
Mm. Well, music to my ears. Yes.
Think alike on that.
Well, you've already started answering this second question, but please share a sketch then of your academic career, especially highlighting the parts that involve teaching and writing about the biblical languages.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I went on right after Moody to go do an MA in Old Testament and Semitic languages at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. While I was there, I was somewhat influenced towards certain PhD programs. One of my professors there was a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and sort of pushed me in that direction. And again, the selling point was language. He told me, he said, and that program is now defunct, but when it was around, he said, what people say about the reputation of the University of Wisconsin is those graduates know their Hebrew language, because it was a Hebrew language program primarily, although it was training a lot of people in biblical studies. But it was ancient Hebrew and cognates from the Northwest Semitic area. And so we actually had a hiatus, as I mentioned. I went overseas to teach for a couple of years. My wife is a missionary kid from Indonesia, a Canadian, but grew up in Indonesia. And my father-in-law sort of said, if you're at all interested in teaching overseas cross-culturally, feel free to jump in and get your feet wet before you go on to a PhD and maybe put those graduates studies in perspective for what you want to do. So we went over there, just loved it, fell in love with it so much that we stayed for an extra 6 months versus what we were supposed to stay for, and actually talked about doing a PhD at a distance and staying over there. But it seemed best for us to come back, and I had gotten into the University of Wisconsin program. So we came back and settled down in Wisconsin. Supposedly it was going to be a couple of years for classwork and then perhaps go back overseas and finish the dissertation. Turned into 9 years living in Madison, Wisconsin, partly because of our growing family. We had 2 boys when I started. We had 4 boys by the end. And along the way, after I'd finished my coursework, I was offered the position of teaching fellow, teaching first and second year Hebrew in the department. And so that was a 3-year contract. So that sort of kept us in that area and enabled me to really, I mean, there's no way, and you know this from your own experience, there's no way to learn the language better than to teach the language. And so for me, that was an extremely great learning experience, just to be able to be teaching undergraduate and graduate students first and second year Hebrew for 3 years there. And so when I finished my dissertation, like many people have experienced in today's world, I finished and said, what next? And there were no job openings at the time. The Lord is very gracious and sort of brought us along through a number of lean years, we might call it. I adjuncted at Wheaton College, at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I adjuncted at the University of Wisconsin, teaching both undergraduate courses somewhat beyond my real comfort level. One of them was Jewish cultural history from the earliest stages through medieval Spain. By the time I got to medieval Spain, I lectured my notes and then left immediately, so no questions could be asked. Because I was not real prepared for that. But I also got the chance to do, for instance, Canaanite dialects, the epigraphy material in the department to students behind me there as an adjunct. So it enabled me to dive more into the languages. And what really drew me to Wisconsin, as I mentioned, is their teaching of Hebrew. In my years in the Philippines, I happened to pick up some texts on biblical studies and linguistics. And I just really fell in love with how linguistics can sort of give us a theoretical framework to approach the language that goes beyond the traditional grammar rooted in its Latin categories that are sometimes ill-suited for what we have in a Semitic language like this. And so when I came to the University of Wisconsin, again, a real provision of God was that I started in and said, I want to do a focus on linguistics in Hebrew, and doing a linguistics minor in the linguistics department there. But there was nobody really equipped to supervise my dissertation until my second year. when Cynthia Miller was hired, and it worked out wonderfully. My second year there, I was in a seminar on linguistic approaches to biblical Hebrew with her, one of her first courses there, and she steered me into looking at the verbal system. And from there, much of my study has rooted in just sort of an initial investigation on Psalm 78 and what the verb is doing in there. So from there, we spent a number of years doing adjunct work. I was teaching, and eventually, and your listeners will probably know it fairly well, took a position at Eisenbrauns Publishers, who specialize in biblical studies in ancient Near East. And I was an acquisitions editor there for about 18 months. And it was terrific experience, especially from the end of writing and publishing, just getting to see the internal workings of all of that and really developing more of a network of scholars while I was there. But after 18 months of reading manuscripts, I was really convinced the Lord wanted me back in teaching. And so I threw my hat back in the ring, and through a number of twists and turns, the Lord sort of providentially brought us to Asbury, which I found to be a absolutely perfect fit for me. It's great colleagues here, wonderful program. I got hired to help staff the PhD program by sort of freeing up some of our senior scholars to launch that program. And in the years since I've been here, since 2007, our PhD program has grown. We have a lot of international students, which is exciting with my heart for overseas missions and stuff, to be able to have a lot of students coming to us to be trained and then be sent back out around the world. And I've sort of found my niche here. I teach our intro class regularly, and I teach advanced exegesis courses, particularly in wisdom literature and Isaiah I've done as well. But a lot of the stuff I do as well is the Semitic language classes. And so I teach the biblical Aramaic regularly. I get to rotate through things like, Syriac and advanced Hebrew grammar and Ugaritic and courses such as that. And all along, it's nice because it sort of has enabled me to consolidate my research interests then, because my research interests are very much on the Hebrew and Aramaic language systems, and then how those are evidenced in the text itself. And so sort of going back and forth between analysis of the language and analysis of the text that gives us that prime data to understand. So my research agenda has largely been steered in terms of concern for the language and the sort of courses that I get to teach, and how out of those courses these various research projects emerge.
Well, and of course, one thing about writing books is that your teaching then extends beyond the people in the classroom.
Yeah.
So, yes. Well, speaking of writing books, you wrote the Baylor Handbook on the Hebrew Bible volume on Aramaic, Ezra, and Daniel. So please share what led you to write this technical textual commentary. And, you can even share about the need that this book addresses.
Yeah, it's an exciting project. So it's interesting. I mean, the most pragmatic answer is I was teaching Hebrew every spring for a number of years. And as you know, if you're dealing with the same material over and over again, at some point you start to go, I really need to sort out some of the issues, because, you always run into those rough spots. You go, well, I'm not quite sure what's going on here in the text. And so shortly into that time period, Dennis Tucker, who is the editor of the series, had contacted me about the series, wanted to discuss a little bit the direction of the series and any advice I might have for how we might develop it further. And so I really jumped at the opportunity and just said to him, would you ever consider a volume on the Aramaic portions? I realize it's the handbook on the Hebrew Bible, but what about the Aramaic? And so I really started developing it because I was teaching it on a regular basis, and then I wanted to contribute to that series. I've really been persuaded the series fills a really needed niche. And, anybody who's worked with the languages, at some point you'll find yourself going, well, what's going on in this passage? And it's not simply something you can go to GKC or another grammar to answer. It's something you need to look at the specific text. And so you pick up any number of critical commentaries off your shelf, and not inevitably, but very often, too often, what you'll find is the very problems you're encountering in the language are the very problems they're skirting, and they're just moving around it. Like, well, yes, it's a problem. Let's move on and deal with the larger exegetical issues. And I sympathize with that. There's only so much you can deal with the language and some of those commentaries. I think the Baylor Handbook is lining up at this point to sort of be that companion volume. So while you pick up a Hermeneia commentary or a word biblical commentary, and it'll tell you the exegetical points about the text, in order to understand the text itself that lies behind those exegetical decisions, the handbook is going to give you that grammatical detail and that syntactical analysis. And so, I found a lot of students sort of start to think of it in that way, that these handbooks are nice companion volumes as they work through texts and are able to add to the information that is available in our standard commentaries.
And indeed, if the series had just stuck with Hebrew, we wouldn't have this Aramaic volume right there.
Exactly. I recall clearly when they were setting up the title page and everything, I said to them, do we really want the subtitle a handbook of the Hebrew text, or do we want to change it to Aramaic here?
That's right.
So, yes. Yeah.
I think I even saw a promotional graphic where it actually had Hebrew on there.
Yes. Yes. It was like a trick, we're going to tell you how all the Aramaic texts are actually Hebrew.
Well, speaking of now specifically Daniel, because that's what we've just finished and Daily Dose of Aramaic, this is a bigger question than linguistics. So this gets over into the realm of the commentaries. And I'm just interested in what your view is. How do you see the bilingualism of the book of Daniel, where there's some in Hebrew and there's some in Aramaic, influencing what we're going to do with this book, our interpretation of it?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of different approaches that scholars have taken on this. Of course, a lot of them have been rooted in, well, how was it composed, since we have these two languages? Was it originally Aramaic and translated to Hebrew, or parts of it, or vice versa? I'm going to skirt those issues to some degree. I think there is some important interpretive import to switching from Hebrew to Aramaic and then back again. And for one, I think literarily it unifies the book. So one of the things, of course, if you're reading through Daniel, people will quickly recognize chapters 1-6 are stories about Daniel and his friends in captivity. And as soon as you get to 7, you get to these visionary experiences that Daniel has through the rest of the book. And yet the language division of the bilingualism doesn't line up with that. You've got chapter 1 is Hebrew, but it's a tale about Daniel and his friends being taken into captivity. And chapter 7 begins the visionary experiences of Daniel. And yet that's in Aramaic still, and you don't switch until the end of 7 back to Hebrew. So for one, there's a sense in which literarily, I think the bilingualism ties the book together and makes it a more of an evident unity than we might otherwise determine. I mean, Old Testament scholars love to cut and dissect and take things apart. And who knows what would have happened with our studies of Daniel had we not had the fact that, hey, folks, don't go cutting this apart into these are the tales and these are the visions, because the bilingualism binds those two together.
Right.
So that's one thing. I think the other thing is when you read the Aramaic of Daniel, and your listeners and viewers will recognize this since you've just been working through those portions, it's full of foreignness compared to the Hebrew Bible. You've got Persian terms going on. You've got Greek terminology going on. I think it gives it an air of foreignness, and as such, sort of a certain objectivity. In fact, one of my coworkers here, Dr. Bill Arnold, who people will know his name, years ago wrote a piece on sort of that viewpoint being influenced by the language itself. As you move from Hebrew, which is thought of as the ownership of the original readers, even if they're speaking Aramaic on a regular basis, there's that idea that our heritage is Hebrew. This is what we speak in the synagogues. This is what we recite scripture in. And yet when you get to these stories, it sort of removes you from that a bit and gives you this view of, oh, this is a situation that's somewhat foreign to us. I think in some ways that's a powerful mechanism because it gets one thinking how to apply it to one's own circumstance. So, in hermeneutics, we talk about this idea of sort of having to recognize the distance between ourselves and the text to begin with. That all too often we run roughshod in how we're interpreting and applying, because we assume, oh, well, the early church, that's just like us, or the Israelites, they're no different than we are. Recognizing first that there's that distance sort of helps us to negotiate that process of entering into the world of the text and realizing that it's foreign to us in some sense, and then making that interpretive move back to say, okay, so by analogy, how does God reveal himself in our circumstance? How does he determine, and guide us into what pleases him in our own context?
There's plenty of issues to think through there. And you just pick up your English Bible and look at Daniel, and then you might not be thinking along those lines.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even just reading the Bible in its original languages does that same effect for us as as moderns and non-Hebrew speakers, non-Aramaic speakers, to have to encounter it in that foreign garment or guise forces us to sort of contend with how it's different, and yet it still speaks into our own circumstances.
Yes. Well, as we come to a close, what would you like to say to our viewers about the value of learning Aramaic? Because this can be a little bit of a hard sell, say in a ministerial training program like a seminary, where it's like, okay, we spend a lot of time with one biblical language, then we spend a lot of time with this other biblical language. Are you telling me I have to study another one?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, as with all of those languages, I think part of it is just recognizing and putting aside our desire for instant gratification. I mean, from living overseas, I know from living overseas, to go into another culture and then say, well, I'm not going to learn their language. You're cutting yourself off from just a wealth of understanding of what's going on in that culture. And the same thing goes for biblical languages. To not know Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic means you are really cutting yourself off from a million minute ways in which you're going to pick up on what's going on in the text, what's going on in that culture, and understand it more fully. And so we sort of have to put aside the instant gratification to begin with. And I think for Aramaic in particular, your watchers may be surprised to know in past years I've tagged on a week of looking at the Targums, the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew portions of the Bible, in my Aramaic course. And what's most interesting is the year that I put it at the beginning, and we did a few chapters from the beginning of Genesis, and I had a bit of complaining from students because, of course, it's a slightly different pointing system that's used. It's the Babylonian system where the vowels are above the letters rather than below. And as soon as we dove into Ezra, and your watchers will know soon enough that there's some challenges to Ezra that are not in Daniel in terms of grammar and syntax and vocabulary, they immediately said, can we go back to the Targum? Because the Targum seems a lot easier now by comparison to the biblical Hebrew text, or the biblical Aramaic text, I should say. And I think part of that is because we have such a small fragment of Aramaic in the Hebrew Bible, whereas the Targums are much more consistent. And so in many ways, doing biblical Aramaic is going to be a avenue to being able to look at other Aramaic texts that are going to greatly expand one's appreciation. That's one example, the Targums. The other one I'll mention is some of our graduate students came to me and said, hey, would you do a reading session with us on something in rabbinics? And so we did some reading in Genesis Rabbah, which is a midrash on the book of Genesis. And it's got some great stories in there. And the rabbis always have some entertaining explanations for things. But what interested me is that we actually have an admixture of Aramaic and Hebrew all together. And so to the point where you stop thinking about, am I reading Aramaic here? Am I reading Hebrew? You're reading both and. So the more you get into the biblical Aramaic, the more it'll open up avenues to other areas of ancient writing in Aramaic and Jewish literature and things like that. So, again, the importance of just getting at the Bible in its original languages can't be overemphasized. And in addition, it'll open up other avenues of study.
Indeed. Well, it's just exciting even to hear about the kinds of things that you've been able to do there at Asbury with Aramaic in addition to Hebrew.
Yeah, yeah, it's been exciting. It's been a wonderful place to be.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Cook, thank you for spending this time with us on Daily Dose of Aramaic.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a privilege to be with you all.